I find it amazing when I share who I am as a human being. I have a confidence because I'm bearing witness to my own experience. And I suppose that's what I'm always doing in the podcast. I'm really just telling stories. But when I try to move into the realm of an idea, I'm on less certain ground. And I can, when I look back on the 3 talks that I've given so far, and this is number 4, but when I look back on the 3 talks, I find that weakness. On the first one, I was reflecting on Lamrim, and I said that I was drawing from the Lamrim teachings. I was sharing my enthusiasm for the teachings, and I was going to try to show how they fit into a Christian or Western life based on my experience. So it was all about sharing but not teaching. Because I'm not competent to be a teacher, but I'm competent to share with you what my feelings are or what my story is. I have my own experience of how beneficial the Lamrim teachings have been to me, and I'm delighted to share that with you. And I remember the first thing that I tried to share was how important a teacher is in my life, how important a teacher is, I think, for the way you go about being a Buddhist. And you find a teacher, and I'll say it again, I think that no matter what religious tradition you're looking at, whether it's Islamic or Jewish, Christian or Buddhist, find a teacher in the mainstream, a common sense person, a saintly or holy person, and you'll identify them when you meet them. And, really see the first time you go to meet a teacher, see it as an examination, like as an interview for a job. And bear in mind that it's the teacher is doing the interview and you're making the decision. When you get a good teacher, I think your life changes. I was talking to a Muslim man. He was a taxi driver in Dublin during the week, and again, for some reason, we just got into talking about faith experience, his faith as a Muslim, mine as a Christian. And at one stage, he stopped the car. I was really enthusiastic about talking. He stopped the taxi, turned off the engine. He said, we're not supposed to talk religion to people who are in the taxi. But then we talked religion for about half an hour because the two of us were on the same kind of wavelength. And he was saying, and he wasn't listening to my podcast, but he was saying the same thing. He said, in his experience, you must have a teacher in your life. You must have somebody that you really feel is wise, is holy, who inspires you, that you're really a fan of, if you like. You must have a teacher. And he said, and when you do, you must do everything they say. There's no point in having a teacher and not listening to them. And he said, that will make you happy. And I honestly think he's right. And I don't care that there are dangers in that, because there are dangers in everything. And we're not children, we're adults, so we can kind of use discernment when we're up against a teacher who is talking nonsense or who is trying to manipulate or abuse us. Because you will get charlatans in every walk of life, including in the robes of monks and holy people. So you have to have your eye out for a charlatan and not be following what they would say. But everyone will find their own teacher. And many times I think the teacher is not necessarily an official monk or nun or person in robes or therapist. teacher can be sometimes an informal person that you know, and that maybe only you know he or she is your teacher. Somebody that you just are inspired by, that you like being with, you listen to their advice, and that in some sense that everything they say seems to mysteriously connect intuitively with things that you're also thinking. I had that experience definitely with Tom McIntyre. And I knew McIntyre over a period of, I'd say, 40 years. And in all that time, I wasn't really very close to him socially. I was his inferior, if you like, because I was much younger. I was a boy when he was in his, he was, 30 years older than me anyway. But, so I'd be very respectful when I was with him. And I wouldn't meet him very often. And sometimes he'd invite me to dinner, or, I'd go and have an evening with him, or sometimes stay over for a night with him when he was living near the lake in Cavan. But always I had this sense that I'd be nervous going to visit him. I'd be on a little bit on edge at the dinner table. And I thought that was a really, really good thing, because I revered him. And when you revere somebody like that, you can be sometimes a little bit intimidated by them. And I was intimidated by him also, because he was so erudite and so intelligent, and he knew so much more, and he'd ask me about books and refer to books that I hadn't read and I should have read, So he was a wonderful guide. And I suppose a guide would be another word for what I'm trying to say as a teacher. And then there was another person, I'll not use his name, but he is still to the good in the county of Fermanagh. Again, he was a little bit older, a good bit older than me. And he was a teacher. There was something about being with him that, like McIntyre, you'd be nervous, you'd be intimidated, but you'd feel you had a new perspective on life every time you came away from him. And there are other people that have been teachers to me, informal. There have been women and men. Marjorie Cross, I'll use her name, it doesn't matter. She was running the Tibetan Buddhist Centre in West Cavan when I first crossed the threshold, and she to this day is a very important teacher in my life. Again, I'm not in contact with her at all. Every so often, twice a year, maybe we have a little exchange. But there's a sense that her presence is in the world, and she's like it's like having a compass, It's really very powerful what a teacher can be when you start to identify teachers and guides, and you can name them to yourself. And also that you can be discerning and check them out and make sure that you're not naively following somebody who is off the wall. And by off the wall, I don't necessarily mean, somebody who's kind of, way out, living in Leitrim with a long beard and eating lentils and talking gobbledygook or something. I mean, you can get people who are off the wall and they live in modern areas of cities and they work in offices and there's everybody, there's a danger that everybody goes off the wall. So you have to be careful about some teachers. But you get people, whether they're formal teachers, like, they're running a Buddhist centre or whatever, or it might be just somebody in your life. It might be an old granny or an old aunt. And to cherish the teacher is in itself, for me, the start of all faith. And that is one of the big things they emphasize in the Lamrim teachings at the very beginning is find a teacher. Now, there's a point I always make in relation to teaching. It's a point that's made in the Heart Sutra, where it says the ultimate teaching is that there is no teaching. And I'm not competent enough to explain the whole rigmarole of that in its beauty and delicacy. But it's a way of never gripping the teaching as like a truth that you own, or you've got the right teaching. And it's amazing how in Buddhism always the first step is renunciation. The first step is ahimsa, non-violence. To not be violent with your body, your speech, your mind, is to really renounce all that instinct of desire and spontaneous energy where you want to promote something that you call yourself, your ego. I am the one, and I will now be who I am, and this is my opinion, and I disagree with you, and blah, blah, blah. Trying to renounce all that by controlling the three doors of your body, your speech, your mind, not allowing negative thoughts to be spoken, not allowing them to even grow in your mind, and certainly not allowing your body to do negative or violent things to anybody. That kind of radical non-violence and renunciation is where it starts. And that means that you try to give up not just tea and sweets, and not just give up alcohol, and not just give up all the physical appetites, that's usually what we do in Lenten times. We give up stuff, which is very good. It's the same kind of renunciation as Buddhists use. But there's also a kind of a thing happens inside in your mind where you try and give up certain ways of looking at the world. One of the ways we look at the world is the presumption that the self exists and that I am the most important self in the room, and I move about in my ego like I am the one, I'm going to suit this person, I'm entitled to these things, these are my rights, all that sort of sense of a self. So you're really trying to change your idea on that when you're Buddhist. You try not to grip things too tightly. I know that there's times I grip things like my politics, my identity, my love of rural Ireland, my love of... And I like to think that, I hold them very tightly until I meet somebody with another opinion. Like, for example, I would have a strong sense of Ireland as a, free, independent republic. But then I might meet somebody from a unionist tradition living in Ulster who's a totally different view of the same territory. And I would find that challenging. And if I'm going to be Buddhist, I need to be able to let go of ideas like that as well, political ideas. I notice that sometimes I get into watching YouTube. I get into watching, various political discourses on YouTube, which would be about, let's say, gender ideology or something. And again, all these new ideas that arise, you can tend to have very, very strong opinions on them. Even I'll put it this way, even the Ukraine war, the war in Europe, the war against Russia, whatever your view on that, there's a way that war is so terrible and it affects us that there's a whole cluster of ideas around it. If you take, or if you listen to someone like Claire Daly, and then listen to somebody like Joe Biden, you realise that there's a whole weave of ideas around the war. You're for defending Ukraine. You're against the idea that another country could intrude, like the Russians did, invading another country, breaking their borders. And you hold that firm and you feel like, well, I have to do that. That's what you do if you believe in justice. And I wouldn't disagree with you on that. But there's also a way whereby underneath that you'll find a whole cluster of opinions that you hold like with such ferocity that you'd get red in the face being angry if somebody disagreed with you. Now, Buddhism would never be to renege on the principle of justice, but it would at the same time, I think, encourage you to have an open mind on every idea, to try and look at every idea from two sides, based on the fact that the ultimate teaching is there is no teaching. And sometimes the teachings themselves are the last thing that somebody lets go of, so that they get a grip. Yeah, you have a grip on your politics, and you have a grip on your opinions about the war in Ukraine, and you have your opinions about gender ideology, and you have all these opinions are in your mind. And you let go of them, because you're trying to be a Buddhist. And you're reading some good book by the Dalai Lama. And then after 6 months, you've let go of all these other opinions, but you now hold to the ideas that you've learned in Buddhism as if they are now the truth, and they substitute for everything else. And now you're gripping Buddhist ideas with a tight fist, because they are the truth, you think. And that's where the Heart Sutra says to remember that the ultimate teaching is that there is no teaching. I had a wonderful experience at that one time. I've mentioned it before. I've no apologies about telling this story again. My teacher, the Panchen Utrul Rinpoche, was delivering a talk in Jampeling, and when he was finished, a young student who was in the front row and feeling very, very kind of like, I'm a real good student, I'll help everybody else. So when the Rinpoche said, is there any questions? This man said, well, Rinpoche, there's some people here now for the first time. It'll be their first experience of a Tibetan teaching. And one thing that they might find difficult is the idea of reincarnation. So could you say a few words about that? And in a sense, the young, zealous student was so engaged with the teachings himself, so convinced that he was holding a grip on the truth, that he reverently wanted his teacher, the Rinpoche, to explain it all to the other people. Not to him now, but to the others, the ones who would be new, him being, let's say, experienced. And the Rinpoche laughed his head off. When your man asked, could you explain something about reincarnation, the Rinpoche said, sure, maybe it is not true. And it was like a jaw-dropping moment for the young student, for me, and for the people who are new. The people who are new to the teachings were relieved because they thought, oh, well, that's amazing. Now we can actually be here even if we have difficulty with the idea of reincarnation. And of course they could be there. It was clearly showing how Buddhism is not about ideas. The ultimate teaching is there is no teaching. Things are true as far as they go. Check them out. Look and listen to the Buddhist teachings, and when you find something that is difficult, like that doesn't sit well with you, that you feel, oh, I think that's a weird idea, like reincarnation, just let it go. It's not something you have to believe. You don't have to believe anything to be Buddhist. All you have to do to be Buddhist is just awaken. As the Dalai Lama said one time, just get up early in the morning. Become awake. There's no naming it. And that, I think, is one of the great beauties that I experience in Buddhism, that it actually keeps my mind open to the possibility that I'm wrong about everything. And that to feel I am wrong about everything is a wonderfully tranquil place to be. I don't have to argue with anybody. I don't have to feel threatened because somebody else has a different opinion than me. If they have a different opinion than my opinion, and if my opinion is something I hold to tightly, then I'm in trouble, because then I feel threatened by their opinion. But if I feel that maybe my opinion is right, maybe their opinion is right, who knows? Now I'm more relaxed. That's one of the things I think that Buddhism has helped me over the years be a little less argumentative than I used to be. And I'll tell you, in all honesty, the only place I get argumentative now is when I would have a drink. And sometimes, like even last weekend, I was in company and I wasn't drinking too much. I was drinking maybe 2 glasses of wine over an entire meal. And the conversation went on a long time after the drink, after the meal. And the drinking went on. And eventually I found that I was getting bored with the conversation. Now, I was just getting bored. I could have left the room and gone for a walk, but I didn't. I wanted to stay with the people that I was with, and I enjoyed their company, but I was getting bored. So what did I do? I had another glass of wine. And after another glass, I had another glass. And I was doing something that a lot of people who drink do, and it's not a good sign, when you're drinking because you're bored. You're in company, it's not just really putting you on fire, and so you start taking another drink. And when the wine was gone, I started drinking brandy. And then what did I do? I got argumentative. I started to pick little holes in what people were saying. We were discussing the institution of marriage. And I started to consciously provoke people by throwing out extreme ideas. Now that was, as they say, the drink talking. Because up until then, everybody in the room was happy. Everybody's getting on grand. I'm a little bit bored. So I start to take a drink. And after taking a drink, I get into a little bit of a mischievous mood, and I start thinking, okay, where can I say something provocative that will, enliven the conversation? And I would have thought I was doing a good job at enlivening the conversation. I would have thought, isn't that I'm an animator. I'm actually kind of making the conversation more scintillating. Maybe I am. But what I focused on the next day, apart from the fact that I had a terrible hangover, what I focused on was the fact that I had taken the extra drink, because I was bored. And it struck me that it is only in that situation where there is a little bit too much drink that the argumentative self inside me, the demon of argument, started to emerge. Okay. You can see how valuable Buddhism is to me. Because I suppose as a writer, as somebody who's dealing with language every day of the week and playing with language, I mean, I sit at the screen every single day of my life with sentences in front of me, and I fiddle with the sentences, and I drop words and put in words to make the sentences more interesting. So it's like, this is my craft, making words connect and firing them up and making it interesting. And so you can see how a person like that in a conversation might be very much the one that would be argumentative, because they're trying to enliven things all the time. Very often they're succeeding, and very often if there's drink on the table, they're not succeeding, because the drink gives you this very false sense of what's happening around you, so that you have a conversation with somebody when you're drunk, and it's like, it's complete delusion. You think you're experiencing what's happening, and yet because you have chemically dulled your consciousness, you actually don't really take in the reality of how the conversation is going at all. And I can see very, very well how a primary thing in Buddhism is no alcohol. No alcohol, obviously no drugs of any form, shape, size, or colour. And those two things in themselves are great pillars of Buddhism. You know, to find a teacher, to try ahimsa, that non-violence of body, speech, mind, to control those doors, not to be automatically operating at a negative level with your body, with your speech, or with your mind. And you can see how me being argumentative fits into a misuse of speech. You can see how ahimsa, or non-violence in speech, that if you weren't to say ever anything that was provocative or negative, control your tongue, if you like, then you'd see how that's a very deeply Buddhist thing to do. It's funny, like, what I'm realizing in these talks is that, in my experience, Buddhism is not something you can actually touch, name, grasp. It's almost like a space within you that opens up if you do certain preliminary things. So the preliminary things, like find a teacher, like practice ahimsa, that non-violence of body, speech, or mind, they open up a space. And that's Buddhism. You know, you can't get the butterfly to land on your shoulder, but if you stay still, the butterfly lands on your shoulder. So it's like making space for something. It's like making space for the new birth. It's like making space for a guest. The sense of a teacher. The teacher may be, if you're very, very fortunate, a teacher will appear. You will realize by the end of these talks that there is a teacher down the road or at the end of a phone or online who's just right for you. Or alternatively, you will recognize a teacher that's already in your life, whether it be somebody in official, in robes, or a professional, or maybe just somebody in your family. And just one other thing to consider in relation to teachers. You know, you could have somebody who is a devout Christian and they could be a great teacher in opening your mind to Buddhism. In other words, they don't have to be a practitioner of what you want to explore. So, for example, I could go to my teacher, my Buddhist teacher, as I did at the very first meeting, and say, I will always be a Catholic priest. And he would say, this is very good. So he's helping me to be a better priest. Or you could go to a nun some wise nun in a convent who would become your spiritual director, and you could say to her, I'm studying a text of Tibetan Buddhism. And she might say, that's very good. Because every worthy religious teacher, spiritual director, they will always know that what you're trying to find is a space within yourself which is like much, much bigger than the actual religious path that you're using to get there. It's the old story of the finger and the moon. Religion is like the finger, it points at the moon. But the reality of God is the moon. The reality of ultimate being and bliss is the moon. It's not the finger. The finger points, gives you a pathway to the moon. And it's the same in religion. It is a pathway. And so it can be very often really interesting to have a teacher who maybe is, a Christian, but they're actually guiding you in a way whereby you're studying Tibetan Buddhist texts. Now, another thing I'd say about the teacher is if you can't see a teacher that's already in your life, if you can't see somebody, and if you're not motivated to take up a phone, if that sounds too much like, going too deep into religious practice, I think that a very good thing to do is to open up your heart like you're longing for a teacher. Like, believe that the teacher will come and that it might take 3 months or 6 months or even 3 years. But that somewhere in the whole shape of the world and the way that everything gets kind of revealed to you in the context of your experience, that somewhere along the road a teacher is going to show up. And you'll know them for what they are when they appear. Now that's a wonderful, I find it's wonderful to live like that, because that leaves me open to the possibility that every single person I meet today might just be the Buddha, might just be the new wise teacher who has manifested in front of my eyes. And it could be an opportunity for me to grow as a human being through this person. And in this regard, a very central thing they say in Buddhist practice is that your enemy is your greatest teacher. You're living with somebody who's difficult. While they can be the greatest teacher, they teach you patience. So, the teacher is a huge idea, and it's a practical idea. And the final thing that I went on to talk about was the sense of like a feng shui, a kind of a physical balance that in your body, if you would imagine prostrating in front of an icon of the Buddha, and you did it with your 2 hands to the top of your head, and then moving the joined hands down just so that the fingers are underneath the chin, and then down to where your heart is, and then stretching yourself on the floor. That act of prostration, it has a totality that is physical. The hands touch the top of the head, referring to the body. They touch the throat, referring to the speech, and they touch the heart, referring to the whole mind, the whole compassionate mind of your being. And with all of these, you stretch yourself on the floor, prostrate before the Buddha. It is a physical prayer. And if I see somebody in a cloister of a Christian monastery at 6 a.m. and they are stretched on the floor, prostrated in front of the statue of some saint, I see exactly the same thing, that the body is used, despite whatever the religion is. It might be Islamic, it might be Christian, it might be Jewish, but that sense of using the body to express a totality of surrender, it's in every religion. And that is a huge place to begin with Buddhist practice. So if you get, let's say, a really nice, pleasant book, you treat yourself to a book. Not a book by some, best-selling author that you know nothing about, and he's just, had a big success writing a cool book about Buddhism or something, or mindfulness. No, but actually a kind of an original text. I would call these original texts. Something, let's say, by the Dalai Lama, which is maybe, the Dalai Lama's explanations of the work of Atisha, or something that is connected with the Lam Rim teachings. And you buy such a book, the very fact that you would never leave that book on the ground, the very fact that you would never leave another book on top of it, the very fact that you kind of try and reverence the book by maybe having it just in a corner of a shelf on its own, where you're aware of it's there, and it's like you begin to treat it like a sacred object. That's physical. But it will totally affect how you approach the teachings, Buddhist teachings. And then the same goes if you have, let's say, a figure of a Buddha. That you're not putting a statue of a little Buddha on the mantelpiece just in the same way as you might put an ornament. If you want it to have power and energy in its physicality, then you treat it in a certain way. You get a corner where there is nothing else. And you put, if you were really doing it to the full extent that maybe a Tibetan might, you'd get a lovely scarf. They have these silk scarves, blue ones in Mongolia and white ones in Tibet. And you'd find, at least in Jampiling, that they sell them for €2 or something. And you'd have one of those, and you'd put that underneath the figure of the Buddha. And you might put some kind of a little empty space as well, a little globe of emptiness, or a little stupa that signifies the emptiness of all being. And you might put a text. Now I have on my shrine, I have a tiny little text which is written, and then it's written in Tibetan, but it's signed by my teacher. And it's wrapped in a red silk, and then that sits there as well. And that to me is a representation of the teachings. And you make those things into a really special place. You might have water bowls, you might have a little candle that you'd light whenever you were trying to do a 10-minute mindfulness, whatever. And it would become what you might call a shrine. And you would notice that it's exactly similar to what Orthodox Christians do with icons. They have a little icon corner in the room, somewhere in the house, where it's just designated for those icons, and those icons are treated not as pictures or images or secular objects or aesthetic objects, but they are, and they're not treated as magical objects. They're not treated as kind of, you're not worshipping the image, the icon itself. You're worshipping what is deep. What is deep in the being of the world and is coming at us through the lens of the icon. That's what you're engaging with. So the icon in orthodoxy is a lens, a window into heaven, and a window whereby heaven is penetrating your little home or your little space. They say, when you're looking at an icon, when you're examining an icon, you're reading the icon. And they say that you begin by reading the icon, and after maybe a couple of hours or a couple of years, the icon begins to read you. Because your conscious mind is starting to shift its awareness to the reality that on the surface we have an icon, but in the very depth of being, there is a different realm. And from that realm, there is something coming towards you, penetrating you through the lens of the icon. Well, this is the same in the Buddhist tradition. The slight difference is that in Buddhism, you're talking about deducing rationally. From the teachings of the Buddha, you practice them and ask yourself, do they work for you? And if they don't, you discard what doesn't work. And if something works for you, you use it to become a happier person. So that's why Buddhism is so much like the original psychotherapy being practiced and evolved in Tibet for hundreds and hundreds of years. Mind training. And it's simply mind training. That's all it is. And if you train the mind, if you create the space, if you create the conditions, then something arises. What arises is a consciousness that is compassionate, a mind that is coming out of your heart, a sense of awakening that is Buddha. It is that peace and tranquility and bliss that's coming out of nothing, out of your core being, which is eternal being. So you're pushing back all the compulsions, all the ways that you're usually gripping the world. You're usually totally gripping ideas. You're like me, being argumentative. You're guzzling your drink. You're golloping your food. You're just living life, and you're thinking, this is great. I'm living life, and I'm living life for me, because I'm the one here. Why would I be? How could I live for somebody else? I'm here, and I might even be doing good things, and then I feel even better. I might even be practicing sort of charity and help for other people, and then I'd feel even better, and my ego would get bigger and bigger and bigger, and I feel wonderful in myself. But that will crash. Either on a daily basis or on a lifetime basis, that will crash into horror, because you're living what a Buddhist would say is a delusion. The idea that you are permanent, that you are worth nourishing. You're not, because there is no self there. There is no self. What's there? What is inside you? What are you? You are the Buddha. You are an awakened, compassionate entity who is so fortunate to be born as a human being. It is comparable to a turtle in the ocean, in the whole Pacific. Imagine there was one single ring, one of those life belt rings. There's one single one of those floating somewhere in the Pacific, and you are a turtle somewhere in the same ocean. What's the likelihood that as the turtle surfaces, that it would go through its head through the ring of the life belt? Not good odds. And yet that is comparable to how lucky you are to have been born in this human life. Human life is the only realm in which awareness of suffering can lead to the motivation to be free from suffering. How do you get rid of the suffering? You start to resist your compulsions. You start to control negative emotions. And simply by pushing back on all those compulsive things, you will find that something else arises. And it's not, you'll even become more aware of you, as like, you can actually see the emotions running through you. You become more aware. Oh, look, I'm at the dinner table and I'm bored. Oh, now I'm getting little argumentative. Oh, now I'm taking too much drink. You become aware of yourself. And what is it that's being aware? You'll never find it. It's just being here is your wonderful gift that you are already the Buddha. You are already. And if practicing those things help you, then you use them, and then that is Buddhism. So it's logical, it's rational, it's practical, it's getting a teacher, it's reading a book, it's reverencing an image and using your body and your embodiment to sing the music of prayerfulness before an image of the Buddha. And practice, and then say, do I feel better? That's why the Dalai Lama says, when they say, well, how do you be a Buddhist? Get up early in the morning, he says. And he's so clever, because what he's saying is, he knows that if you say, okay, I get up early in the morning, that one tiny step will lead to other steps. I told you the story about the fella who was a servant to a big, wise teacher. And the big, wise teacher was very proud because he was a big, wise teacher. And the servant said, can I study with you? And the big, wise teacher said, no, you can't study with me. Sure, you're a low-class person. You're not even educated in your literacy, You wouldn't understand the subtleties of the teaching. So the servant said, well, can I clean the little hut for you, the little place where you have a hermitage, so that it'll all be lovely and sparkling when you do your meditation? And the big wise teacher said, oh yes, you can do that. And so the years went on, and the big wise teacher did his meditation, and every day the servant cleaned the floor, brushed it, and made everything sparkle and took the dust away. Who became enlightened? Of course, the servant. Because one simple thing is all it needs. One step over the threshold, and you're there. You may have another 10 years to go or 50 years to go, studying teachings and, practices and esoteric ideas, but it all happens in the first step. It all happens in what again in the Orthodox and the Western Christian churches would talk about metanoia. You turn. There's a turning you make in life. You turn to, whether it be the Buddha or what you call God, you turn. You haven't even made a step at this stage, but you've turned direction. So if I'm going to Dunlow, I'm going to Dunlow. I may be almost in Dunlow. I may have walked 5 miles. But if I thought, let me go instead to Errigal, it's 30 miles away. Let me go instead to Errigal. And then I turn. 180 degrees, I just turn. I'm still an awful long way away from Errigal. But I've made the biggest move of my life, because now I'm pointing towards Errigal. Now my pathway is different. And once you're on the path, you're home and dry. That is the one I feel I'd end this 3 or 4 little sessions of meditations, reflections on Buddhism. I feel I could end it there. You see, there's ways to work on the preliminaries of Lam Rim would be the shortness of life. Contemplate the shortness of life. Contemplate that your deeds have consequences. Good deeds, good consequences. Bad deeds, bad consequences. Contemplate the fact that at the point of death, you have nothing to take with you but your deeds, your actions. They have made imprints in your mind, karmic imprints on the way that you form consciousness, and that's who you will be at the end of your life. So if you have to find a pathway through the bardo, as they call it, through the kind of interim period between life and life, you have to find a way, then you'll be stuck with all the karmic imprints that you have layered on your consciousness. And then it'll be too late to change. That is really the shortness of life. And the way that deeds follow us, that's just such a rich preliminary to deal with, to meditate on, to think about. And then you get a teacher, and then you find a nice book, and then you start getting into it. And you find some things work for you as you read them about how to be Buddhist, and some things don't. Obviously, you know that Buddhist teachings would suggest you don't drink alcohol or take anything like that, and obviously you know that I do, because I've already mentioned it. And I gave my teacher a great laugh one time about that, because one time we had been in Mongolia together, and we were in a yurt, and there was a family in the yurt, and there was a little baby, and the little baby had butter put on its cheeks. And this is a tradition that they used to do in Mongolia. They would put butter on the cheeks of a baby, and the butter would go rancid, and it would burn into the cheek, and it would scar the cheek, so that there was a whole cobwebby effect on the cheek for the rest of that child's life. And it was once considered a really positive thing, like a sign of beauty, an ornamentation of the skin. You meet a young woman and she'd have both cheeks like totally spiderweb of blue veins, where this had been done to her as a child. And it would be disapproved of. And when we went into this particular yurt and we saw the little baby with the stuff in its cheeks, the nurse that was with us, that was with the tour, 7 of us touring around, travelling around Mongolia, but the nurse, Swedish, or a Swiss lady, she was not too happy with this, and she was pointing it out to Rinpoche, and I think she hoped that he would sort of, speak to the parents and say, now look here, this is not acceptable. But Rinpoche gently said to the nurse, he said, it is culture. It's culture. They do this here. It's not for us to interfere with it at this moment. So that was wise, but there was one day I remember over in Jampaling, and I was sitting in the garden with Rinpoche. This was about a year later, and I was sitting in the garden with him, and I was chatting away, and I just had an urge to tell him about a particular event that we had a family event that had happened the week before, and I was talking about it, And of course, I talked about the fact that I had a good few drinks. I said I had a hangover. And he said, "Oh, you're drinking." And I said, "Yes, culture." And he had a good laugh at that. You know, that it's a foible of Irish culture that we drink. And it is true. You know, it's in all European nations. Particularly, I think, in the north of Europe. All that drinking of whiskey that's very Irish, Scottish. And the English do a lot of it too. And then you go to Scandinavia and Lord God, they can fairly knock it back. A few little bottles of vodka. So anyway, you can see that I'm not perfect. But I suppose what I'm sharing with you is that the Buddhist teachings are a psychotherapy. And if you get your hands on a proper good book, a text, not a bestseller, but a text by some authority, if you keep your heart open for a teacher, and even if it takes a year or two, just keep your heart open that you will find a wise teacher who is not necessarily Buddhist, but who would be a support and a guide if you were trying to practice Buddhism. And consider the image of the Buddha, consider visiting Jampoling, consider having a shrine somewhere in your workspace or in your bedroom or wherever, but where it's special, where it's just one little corner of a shelf that there's nothing else ever goes there but your little shrine. And you'll find that too, just as in Orthodox tradition, you'll find that the Buddhist shrine and the little image become very alive in a room, very potent. They won't become potent if you have them as an ornament. If they're just there like because, oh yeah, I'm into Buddhism. So, and you see that a lot now, the kind of the accidental use of a Buddhist image for, if you like, aesthetic purposes, to enhance a room. But you'll always know when you see it as a shrine, where it's like in a corner or somewhere just on its own, and maybe there's a candle in front of it or something, that you realise that's a shrine. And eventually, the more you look at it, the more you gaze, it becomes a lens, or it becomes a focal point for a deeper, imaginal level of being, an imaginal realm, the depth, the invisible depth of being that is in all surfaces, and you'll experience its power and energy. And that just completes now 4 meditations that I've done on Buddhism, on Lamrim, for October, and it only scratches the surface. I'm not a teacher, I'm just sharing my enthusiasm. And next week we'll be heading into Samhain, Halloween, All Saints' Night, All Souls' Night, and then the 4 weeks of Samhain. And I'm looking forward to doing a couple of reflections during that time on the nature of, if you like, the communion of saints in Christian terms. How we are all gathered together, not just us, the living, but those who have gone before us, who have, if you like, dissolved into the imaginal realm, and yet are still with us. Start that next week. For now, I thank you for listening to me on this subject. I really appreciate your company. This podcast is not about ideas. It's about being here. It's about being present with you and wherever you are. Whether you're at home, whether you're alone, whether you're listening with somebody else in the car, whether you're listening with earphones, earbuds, running on a beach on the west coast of America, or in the city of Helsinki. Wherever you are, thank you for being here. Bye-bye.